A very warm welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on destitution by design, immigration policy, and the conditions of life-making. My name is Anne Phoenix, Professor of Psychosocial Studies in the Social Research Institute here at UCL. I'm delighted to chair this session and to introduce today's speakers, Professor Rachel Rosen and Dr. Eve Dickson. Before I do that, I just want to let you know that we will have time at the end of the lecture for questions. As soon as you think of a question at any point during the talk, please go to Slido on your web browser and enter the event code #humanity. We look forward to hearing your questions. Well, our two speakers today have worked and published together for several years. Their research compellingly shows how destitution for migrant mothers and children is not random or accidental, but instead is a predictable, intentional consequence of policy that's not just economic, but impacts on every aspect of what they call life-making. They're currently co-leading a project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council on social reproduction in the shadows, making lives with no recourse to public funds. Their co-authored book, Bordering Social Reproduction, Migrant Mothers and Children Making Lives in the Shadows, came out this year. Rachel Rosen is a professor of sociology in the Social Research Institute at UCL. Her research focuses on child and family migration, forced displacement, racialized borders, and the neoliberal state. She's director of the Critical Childhood Studies Centre at UCL. Her numerous publications include the co-edited Crisis for Whom? Critical Global Perspectives on Childhood, Care and Migration. Eve Dickson is a senior research fellow in the Social Research Institute at UCL. Her research focuses on social inequality, migration, childhood, and subjectivity. Amongst her publications, the title No Recourse to Lunch, a frontline view of free school meals and immigration control during the COVID-19 pandemic, is particularly evocative. So welcome, Rachel and Eve.
Thank you very much, Anne, for the really warm welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. Miriam was 13 when we met her, and one day she asked Eve, "How can we help my mom? She really struggles. I worry that we don't have enough money for food and stuff." Miriam went on to explain that her mother would often skip meals just to make sure that the children could eat. She said, "Normally we don't have enough food, so if there's just a little bit, she'll give it to me and my brothers, and then she just has tea or something." Later, Miriam's younger brother Luke, who was 11 at the time, told us that the children also missed meals, not just their mother. The family of four lived in a small two-bedroom flat owned by a private landlord in London. As they took us on a video tour of the flat, we heard that the heat in the flat was intermittent. Large holes were visible in the plaster behind a heater next to the toilet. Miriam explained that the heater had broken, but the landlord had not replaced it, despite the cold and damp winters that they had spent there. Other signs of disrepair were evident around the flat. The lights in the older children's room had burnt out over a year ago, and the children used the torch on the family's mobile phone to see when it was dark. The kitchen sink was blocked and had to be drained manually. Anytime the family wanted to wash dishes or prepare food, Miriam and her mother Surwa would have to run between the sink and the toilet with a bucket, emptying it before the flat flooded. Even the smallest of everyday tasks became large and arduous responsibilities. The family had lived there for 3 years and in London for 10, but they had limited options to improve their circumstances. Surwa had come to the UK from Ghana with the hope of making a better life. And after arriving, she realized she had been made a series of false promises, and life was, in her words, not good like that. She found herself struggling in a difficult relationship with a man who was, quote, a liar and who had, quote, destroyed everything. Because of this, Surwa ended up being undocumented, but she had recently been granted a visa with limited leave to remain, but a leave to remain that was attached with the condition no recourse to public funds, or NRPF. NRPF is an immigration condition contained in the UK's Immigration and Asylum Act 1999. It states that migrants who are subject to immigration control are not allowed to access most mainstream welfare benefits, no social housing, and not other support, such as extended childcare services. According to figures analyzed by the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford in 2019, around 1.3 million people with time-limited leave to remain, and that includes students, people on work visas, and those on family visas. So these 1.3 million people are subject to NRPF in the UK. And a further approximately 674,000 undocumented people have NRPF, which is effectively imposed by default. Previous research has shown that NRPF particularly affects families who are already economically and socially marginalized, such as single mother households and racially minoritized families from Britain's former colonies. So charities have found that at least 382,000 children in Britain are forced into deep immiseration by NRPF, just like we hear from Luke and Miriam in the words I was reading before, or saying before. For families like Surwa, Miriam, and Luke's, it means that no matter how impoverished the family is, next to no social support is available, and other options for getting by are also heavily restricted. Many people, as we've discovered in our research, have never heard of NRPF. It's certainly a less visible and spectacular display of the way that various UK governments have approached the question that they call controlling immigration. NRPF has not caused the same controversy as the Rwanda scheme or plans to house asylum seekers on a decommissioned barge, what migrant justice groups have called a floating prison for people seeking sanctuary. But the families we have met in our long-running research about NRPF explain that its effects are every bit as brutal and drawn out as detention and deportation. So in our work, we call NRPF a form of welfare bordering, a reference to state welfare policies, but also the myriad of institutions, discourses, and practices involved in kind of constraining or contorting people's lives and the labor that goes into making and sustaining meaningful life. Welfare bordering, such as NRPF, is typically presented as something that's natural and necessary part of a national immigration policy. These policies, we're told, they make sense, demarcating as they do boundaries of who deserves support and who doesn't. Ideas of deservingness that have align with nativist nationalist imaginaries. Their basic premise, therefore, often goes unquestioned. So while questions might be raised about whether NRPF's application to specific groups is appropriate, so those who are seen to be mistakenly in the camp of the undeserving and not entitled to welfare. But what is rarely contested is the premise, and indeed the violence that people experience as the result of NRPF itself. Welfare bordering, we argue, is a way that people are abandoned, punished, and their lives made impossible in the heart of one of the richest countries in the world. And this abandonment and punishment is simply because of where they were born, or, in the case of many children, where their parents were born.
Over the past 6 years, we have worked closely with people living in the shadow of NRPF. We have participated in the daily lives of 25 families with no recourse to public funds, conducted interviews, and invited children and adults to take photos, journal, and lead us on video tours of their lives, the places that they live, and about their fears, hopes, and dreams. Among our participants, there was never a single reason within a family or even for individuals as to why they had come to the UK. Many of the children were born in the UK, while others were brought by their parents at a young age. Some mothers had come attempting to flee abuse, while others hoped to make better lives, describing conditions of extreme poverty in their own childhoods. Some had come on visitor visas for short trips to see friends and family, but had ended up staying as their situations changed. For example, unexpectedly starting a family or having a child who suddenly needed specialist medical treatment. What was similar for our participants was that leaving the UK was not really an option. In most cases, this was because their children were British and mothers did not want to uproot their lives. The mothers we met had also been in the UK for over a decade, and despite the hardships they faced, felt that it was home. In some cases, the abuse, extreme poverty, or violence which had compelled their immigration in the first place had not diminished. In others, debts incurred to enable immigration or to survive in the UK would be insurmountable in their countries of origin. Regardless of how and why families were in the UK, their experiences raise questions about how the UK treats them, and that is the focus of our research. Our research focuses on people's everyday lives over time, not just peak moments of crisis. Our longitudinal ethnographic research attests to how welfare bordering operates over time, a slow, grinding process which stretches from the body to the psyche, symbolic and material. The families we met told us that despite their best efforts to make livable lives, the cold, bureaucratic language of no recourse to public funds masks a hard reality of long-term suffering, enforced destitution, and extensive and intensive labour, simply to survive day to day. No recourse to public funds is even imposed on British citizens, children who get dragged into it because of their parents' immigration status and who, simply because they are children, are not afforded access to mainstream welfare support in their own right. There was a rare furore around no recourse to public funds in 2020. At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, then Prime Minister Boris Johnson revealed his own surprise at the policy's existence. Responding to questions about how a family with the legal right to remain in the country would survive without furlough pay and with no right to benefits, Johnson commented, "I'm going to have to come back to you on that, because clearly people who have worked hard for this country, who live and work here, should have support of one kind or another. You've raised a very important point. If the condition of their leave to remain is that they should have no recourse to public funds, I will find out how many there are in that position, and we will see what we can do to help them." End quote. Johnson's political gaffe, not being aware of his own government's policy, was largely interpreted as an example of his own incompetence. But his initial reaction indicates how little is known about this policy, a visa condition which puts Britain's universal welfare system out of reach for so many. In public debates, no recourse to public funds is often presented as a rational and reasonable way of controlling migration. In 2011, when Home Secretary Theresa May expanded no recourse to public funds to include migrant families who had been granted limited leave to remain on the basis of Article 8 rights to private and family life, she stated, "What we don't want is a situation where people think that they can come here and overstay because they're able to access everything they need." End quote. May's claims were echoed in tabloid headlines of the time, which screamed about the so-called human right to sponge off the UK. Article 8 rights had previously accorded migrant families the right to both stay and access social support alongside other UK residents. As a result of May's changes, migrant families were placed on the 10-year route to settlement, with no recourse to public funds for the duration. The 10-year route requires 4 separate applications for temporary status to be made, before applicants can even apply for permanent residence. Every 2.5 years, applicants must pay £1,321 per family member, plus a hefty surcharge for the NHS, which is currently £2,587.50, again per person. The language of securing borders against supposedly spurious family claims echoes in the government's current white paper on immigration. Yet this is a problem that doesn't really exist, according to barrister Jamie Burton, who says that the burden of proof is already very high in these Article 8 cases. The policy also doesn't seem to make financial sense. A social cost-benefit analysis conducted at the London School of Economics suggested that removing no recourse to public funds for households with limited leave to remain on their work-related visa would result in net gains for Britain of 428 million over a 10-year period, due to reduced costs for the NHS, local authorities, and increases in tax revenue. This increases to 872 million if applied to families with children. While this study shows the financial feasibility of jettisoning NRPF altogether, the logic of a cost-benefit analysis roots Britain's cost of living crisis with destitute migrants, rather than asking why wealth is so concentrated, or discussing the ethical principles of a policy which leaves children in fear of starvation.
Isaac is just one example. He was 13 when we met him and was born in London. He lived with his mother Destiny in a shared room. The room was under sloping eaves and packed with their 2 single beds and a protruding wardrobe containing all of their possessions. With the room filled with their drying laundry, it felt particularly small and claustrophobic. Destiny, originally from Nigeria, had limited leave to remain in the UK with NRPF. Isaac, however, was a British citizen, yet the NRPF restriction on his mother's visa also affected him. Isaac felt keenly that a universal welfare system that is not for all is discriminatory. He explained, England is a multicultural country, but NRPF is basically screwing over those people who came from different backgrounds, as it only favors a certain type of people. It doesn't favor the whole of Britain. End quote. The fact that NRPF was basically screwing over racially minoritized people was not just an abstract idea for Isaac. It was both a hard physical reality and a cause of deep anxiety. He told us, I was worried that we didn't really have food, if I was going to eat the right amount of food or if I was going to starve. Many of the children we talked with worried that if they spoke to somebody about their family's situation, they would be stigmatized or their mothers might be blamed for their destitution. But unusually, Isaac decided to reach out to his teacher for help. His fear of himself and his mother starving trumped any concerns he might have had about speaking out. He described his relief when his head of year helped the family access food banks that were not limited by immigration status, so they didn't, quote, have to stress about food. Yet as many of our participants shared, even relief like that was only partial, given the persistent and grinding effects of NRPF. Isaac explained how long after he had gone to his teacher that these feelings persisted. He said, worrying, that puts like dark scenarios in my mind. And I thought like the worst case scenario, I would be living on the streets and I wouldn't really go to school. So it's telling that a policy like NRPF, which is rationalized by the idea that it prioritizes so-called British resources for British citizens, is used to deny some British citizens, like Isaac, access to a social safety net. It is also indicative that a country which purports to value the protection of children, and indeed marks a country's civility by their treatment of children, uses welfare bordering policies like NRPF to deny support and enforce impoverishment on these children. We see something of what Palestinian scholar Nada Shalab-Kevorkian terms unchilding here. She writes about the way that Israel dispossesses Palestinian children from the protections afforded by childhood, and indeed denies childhood itself, in order to justify their arbitrary detention, injury, and even murder in the genocide against Gaza. Shalab-Kevorkian's while her specific point is about Palestinian children, her larger point about the way that denying childhood works as a form of dehumanization is important when thinking about families with NRPF, as it shows how the unthinkable, in this case, the fact that children in Britain don't just fear, but are in experiencing starvation or significant amounts of hunger. So it shows how this unthinkable thing becomes possible and even something that's defended by these policies like NRPF. So indeed, for children like Isaac or Miriam and Luke, who we introduced at the beginning, who have never lived anywhere except the UK, NRPF means a life of destitution, constantly feeling hungry, trapped in uninhabitable accommodation, and without the things needed to make lives. Yet they are typically expected to participate and perform in school and other places the same as other children, and they're even punished when they don't. For example, children with NRPF have been threatened with missing important school activities if their parents owe money for school meals, while others have been sent to detention for failing to wear the proper uniform because their families simply cannot afford it. Samantha was sitting on the sofa during one of our first meetings, wearing a gray wool hat. She called her 8-year-old son Sam over. He looked excited when his mom said he could choose a secret name if he took part in the research. After some whispering and laughter, the two settled on Samantha and Sam. So apologies for the confusion between Samantha and Sam, but it was the choice of the family. 18 years before we met her, Samantha had come to the UK from Nigeria, joining her parents as a young teenager. She, in fact, only discovered as an adult that she had no legal status in the UK and therefore was subject to NRPF. Describing its long-term effects, she said, "It destroys you mentally. And if you're looking after children who are depending on you to be a pillar of strength and depending on you to guide them and look after them and everything, you can't afford to lose yourself. And that's what no recourse to public funds does to people. You lose yourself, you lose your sense of identity." For Samantha, Surwa, and other mothers we spoke with, virtually the only sources of support available lie with other people in equally precarious positions. And like their children, many mothers find it difficult to ask for help. And even when they do, any help is fragile at best. Samantha explained to us that asking for help has, quote, "always come back to bite me in the backside, so I've just soldiered on." She added, "I had no one to fall back on. I had no one to rely on." On one occasion, Samantha mentioned trying to keep costs down when she was working cash in hand. She asked an acquaintance to help her with childcare and paid the woman what she could afford, since costs weren't covered for her. The arrangement ended traumatically when she found scratches all over Sam's body when he returned home one day. Unable to access government support forced her and many of the other women we spent time with to endure relationships and situations that were harmful and painful for them and their children. By the time we met Samantha, she described having a small feeling of relief. Things had been very difficult for many years, she told us, but they had recently eased up a little bit. The family, herself and Sam, were still undocumented, but had recently been able to secure local authority support, which included the provision of a small 2-bedroom house. Though not originally intended for the purpose, local authorities can provide accommodation and financial support to some families with NRPF under Section 17 of the Children Act 1989. And at least 2,873 families were supported by 72 local authorities across the UK in 2024-25, to give you a sense of the scale of destitute families with NRPF. In practice, Section 17 support, however, is minimal, it's very challenging to access, and it's often conditional on accepting difficult requirements, such as moving far away from carefully nurtured social networks or moving to inappropriate or even hazardous accommodation. So although Samantha and Sam showed us their house with evident pleasure, they had initially been reluctant to accept it because it was outside of London where they had been living and where Sam had been going to school. Samantha was so worried about maintaining continuity for Sam that even after moving far away, they continued to make the long journeys back to his previous school. Samantha explained that was costing a lot of money. It was physically and mentally draining. And so she eventually felt compelled to move Sam to a new school where he knew no one, but where at least it was closer to the home. For other families with NRPF, trying to access Section 17 assistance can be a punishing experience.
Martha, who had come to the UK from Nigeria as an adult, was staying with her uncle and cousin when we first met her. She shared one room in their 2-bedroom house with her 3 sons, Kevin, Mobo, and Teo, who were all in their late adolescence. The small room was filled with a double bed, a folded cot, and a wardrobe. There was little room to move. The whole family is just cramped up in there, Kevin said, describing how the family of 4 shared the space, meaning someone always had to sleep on the floor. The family got by on a patchwork of support. An auntie paid for a telephone and lunch fees for the children. Members of the church provided them with food, and friends from back home sent Martha clothes. Martha had considerable caring responsibilities for her youngest son, Tayo, who was visually impaired. On this basis, she had recently approached the council for Section 17 support. As she was explaining Tayo's highly specific needs, which were the subject of the child in need assessment being undertaken, the social worker just hung up on her, she explained. Reflecting on his mother's experiences with social services, Mobo used the words disrespect repeatedly. He explained that his mother was treated as though she was, in his words, stupid, but at the same time as if she were suspicious, because of what he called stereotypes of what a needy person should look like. The entire experience of seeking child in need support from the local authority was, in his words, hurtful and mean, and deeply racialized. His mother was subjected to, quote, negative stereotypes. And he linked this to the way that, in his words, African countries and black nations as a whole were depicted. He told us, it's usually just the bad stuff that makes the news. Such sentiments were echoed also by other children. Meanwhile, being subject to no recourse to public funds for a long time can also make people vulnerable to threats and exploitation, as Tanya told us. Tanya answered the phone with a friendly and open tone when I first contacted her. She was in her early 20s and had come to the UK from Jamaica as an 11-year-old to join her parents. Just like Samantha, she only discovered that she did not have legal immigration status in the UK when she was an adult. Tanya was making what is often called a half-life application, because she was between 18 and 24 and had lived in the UK continuously for more than half her life. Yet even if this application was successful, she and her 2 small children, who were aged 6 months and 2 years, would face another decade being subject to NRPF on the 10-year route to settlement. She told us, it's not an easy thing when you don't have papers in this country for so many years. It's a struggle. It's so frustrating that I've been here for so long. I went to school here, she said. Tanya did not know why her mother had not sorted out her immigration status when her own was settled, and this subsequently made their relationship quite fraught. She described how she was staying with a friend rent-free, but that came with strings attached. Tanya was expected to do all the housework and childcare for both families, even when she was exhausted and heavily pregnant. She told us, I take her kids to school. I clean the house every single day, 7 days a week, never get a break to myself when I was pregnant with my daughter. It wasn't simply that no recourse to public funds meant she couldn't afford accommodation of her own, but being undocumented affected every single aspect of her life. There are limited things that you can do, she said. Like you want to go and get a bank card, you can't. The first thing, have you got any form of ID? No, you don't have it. Oh, you can't get this. The woman she was staying with would often verbally abuse Tanya, telling her that she should not have come to Britain and that she should be locked down because she didn't have her papers. Tanya felt hurt and taken advantage of, but she had nowhere else to go and feared being told to leave. She said, I would take the abuse, like take it, take it, take it. This was a common experience for mothers in our research. They told us repeatedly that asking for help was not something to be undertaken lightly, because it always ran the risk of opening them up to hyper-exploitation. Some told us that there were expectations of repayment through sexual favors or punitive and paternalistic demands for gratitude. Like Tanya, mothers and children often had to stay in situations that were clearly painful, deeply exhausting, and often dangerous because they had effectively been abandoned by the state. Many faced these situations over extended periods of time, regardless of how long they had been in the country and whether they had legal immigration status or even citizenship, like Isaac. It wasn't simply the material reality of no recourse to public funds that stung Tanya. It was having, in her words, people look down on you a lot. She told us about the constant struggle of growing up in Britain, yet constantly being made to feel as though she did not belong. She said, "People look at you. So what are you doing in my country then? As if you're just taking up space." This sense of just taking up space echoes the tabloid rhetoric that was used to rationalize no recourse to public funds and call for its extension. Yet in listening to our participants' stories of their lives, we are struck by how far this is from their reality. The enforced destitution caused by no recourse to public funds required extensive labour simply to survive day to day. From Miriam and Sarah's continual emptying of the sink that would not drain, to Tanya's back-breaking housework in exchange for a bed, to Samantha and Sam's long journeys to get to school. But this idea of just taking up space is almost absurd when we think about the tiny spaces that families with no recourse to public funds are forced to occupy due to their impoverishment. It was not uncommon to hear about families of 4 sharing a single room or living room floor, entirely dependent on the hospitality of friends or strangers. For example, 16-year-old Shanice, who had never slept apart from her mother and rarely in a bed of her own, she told us longingly about her dream of having a space of her own. She said, "If you're constantly sharing a room with someone, you can't get time to always be yourself and just do what you want to do. We're both different people and we move at different paces. Being by myself just means a lot. Like it means a lot to me just to have my own time to reflect." Yet the feeling that Tanya described as being seen as just taking up space, combined with a complete absence of social support, served as a constant reminder to these families that they were not wanted in the UK. Our participants repeatedly conveyed the sense of a persistent wearing of body and soul, what Samantha referred to earlier as losing yourself.
Despite the hardships and the rejection, many of the people that we spoke with refused to give up hope. For example, Abiola was from Nigeria and had been in the UK for 12 years. She was undocumented and subject to NRPF. As a result, her 10-year-old son, Aiken, who was born in the UK and was a British citizen, was affected as well. Abiola was waiting for her immigration application for limited leave to remain as a parent of a British child to be decided by the Home Office. But she had been aware of the high cost of regularizing their status in the UK since Aiken was young. So despite their destitution, Abiola realized that she had to begin to save for Aiken's citizenship application. She told us, "Bit by bit, I opened a box, a shoebox. I made it into something like a safe, and I started dropping money inside that place for 4-5 years." She described how any support she received from her ex-boyfriend would go into the box, as well as little bits of money she earned from her small jobs. She explained, "The least I'm dropping in is £5 because I didn't want to drop pennies, but there will be times in a whole month where I might not even put anything in the box." The shoebox with her savings was a safe, as she told us, but it also symbolized her hopes and dreams. Abiola explained, "Everywhere I go, I take that box with me. I didn't touch it, I kept it. Even if I'm starving, I didn't touch that money, even if I was desperate." She believed that the money would, quote, save her, saying, "I was hoping this is where the future is lying. You have to save for it and get out of this condition and live a better life." Her resolve to save in the face of such extreme impoverishment was more than just an act of survival. It was a refusal to lose herself. And we heard similar stories from other families. So Miriam, 13, spoke about herself and the other children in the family doing all they could to make their mother proud in the recognition that their mother had struggled a lot for us. Meanwhile, Isaac nurtured hope by imagining a future where he could help others who were in the same situation that he was in. And so our work, we offer the idea of weathering, like the weathering of a tree, to keep alive the complex interplay between the welfare bordering that makes lives impossible, which we've been describing, and the lives of people who refuse to accept such impossibilities that are imposed on them. Weathering draws attention to processes of wearing and withstanding, but also of fortification and toughening. And so it allows for the engagement with creative, dynamic, and multifaceted ways in which people with NRPF have to and do plan, strategize, navigate under conditions of extreme duress. And so while the British state may treat these families as disposable, or even worse, by seeking to make their lives impossible, these families' insistence on planning into futures and of nurturing common cause between each other in the family and others beyond the family, this is a challenge to the attempted erasure and denial of life that we see in the NRPF policy. And so we see this weathering, aspects of weathering, as not just the grinding and wearing down, but also recognizing the important forms of creative resistance and a really important reminder that things need not be this way. Things can be otherwise.
Our research shows that the no recourse to public funds policy makes life impossible for those who are subjected to it. It is not a spectacular display of immigration control and rarely makes sensationalized headlines. Instead, the hardship produced by this policy is often experienced in the shadows. The results of this bureaucratic immigration category are endured in the routine of everyday life, year after year. It often remains invisible, even to teachers, healthcare providers, and co-workers. Yet the stories of these families show that the imposition of this draconian immigration rule has done nothing to meet the government's stated aim of protecting the economic well-being of the UK, at least for the most marginalised. In 2022, 1 million children and 2.8 million adults in the UK were living in destitution. These figures include families with no recourse to public funds, who typically experience the most extreme levels of deprivation of all. Indeed, we can see how no recourse to public funds is an experiment in the horrific, tested on groups of migrants, but increasingly widened. For example, the extended 10-year period to achieve indefinite leave to remain, which is imposed on destitute migrant families as they seek to regularise, is now being mooted for all immigrants in Labour's immigration white paper, and the Conservative Party has announced plans to ring-fence benefits for British citizens only. If no recourse to public funds is not a solution to inequality in Britain, and simply penalises and punishes those who are subjected to it, then the question must be asked, why do we have it at all? What sort of alternative futures can we imagine if we jettison a framework of deservingness and national exception altogether?
Thank you very much. That was really excellent. And one of the things that it did so clearly was to humanize the people who you've studied, the mothers, the children, and to give a sense of their everyday struggles and give us an insight into, how that could be a range of different people. They're not just numbers. So can you start off perhaps by telling us, why do you think they continue to be dehumanized when there's research like yours?
Yeah, I can start us off. I think that, yeah, thank you for the question. I think that it's much easier to think about people who, are kind of demonized and scapegoated in our society as just numbers rather than people. And I guess as we've been talking about and as our research has shown, these people really they're part of our communities. They're in our schools, our hospitals, our community spaces, but their experiences are often very hidden, and the kind of brutality that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis is not necessarily something that is very well understood. And I think that even when many of the children in our research, even teachers in their schools, don't understand the kinds of conditions that they're living in. And so I think these things are very hidden. And I think that there is very little space in the public domain for these kinds of stories, unfortunately. And we are, in a time where there are very particular narratives around migration that are given a lot of space in the media, and those are often, very negative, and not very interested in the humanity of people. I don't know if you want to add anything, Rachel.
Okay.
I mean, I think that was a really clear response, Eve. I think the only other thing that I would add that I think is important is the way policies like no recourse to public funds, as we've tried to show, have a really deep material impact. I mean, on the kind of conditions of everyday life, the things that people need to do in order to just get by are extended, lengthened, they're harder, they're longer. And so this process is both material, but it's also this process of dehumanization, as you said, Anne, where families are treated with suspicion. So rather than seeking to understand the conditions of duress that they're living in, we hear from participants about how they're simply blamed for not showing up in the right gym outfit for class, or examples such as that. And so I think these kind of dehumanizing aspects, even the title "No Recourse to Public Funds," require us to think about the kind of complexities of people's lives, and the nature of the ways in which they're both subject to these conditions of duress, but that they're much more than that as well. And so I think in our work we try and grapple with that, is how to show the conditions of duress, but not reduce people to those conditions. So to show the love that you can see between Miriam and Luke and Serwa, who spent most of their time in the research activities cuddling with each other, caring for each other, playing with Joshua the baby. These are show that people are much more than these dehumanizing portrayals that NRPF suggests, or that the kind of rhetorics that Eve was talking about.
Thank you both. There's a question here now, particularly about Tanya, and this is that Tanya's situation sounds very much like modern slavery. So are there data on the links between people who are subjected to NRPF and who become victims of modern slavery? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, a widespread recognition in research that, policies like no recourse to public funds definitely put migrants at risk of modern slavery. I think, we've seen lots of situations that are very close to that, or really, yeah, quite frightening levels of exploitation and abuse that are very difficult to get out of, and very easy to get into when you're experiencing that level of deprivation, and also I think desperation to survive, right? So I think, I have, yeah, spoken to mothers where it took them a very long time to get out of those situations. And I think there's also been lots of research about no recourse to public funds and the connection with domestic abuse. So I think, for many, many years, Southall Black Sisters and others have really drawn attention to the idea that there is no way out, right? And it's very difficult to get out of abusive relationships when you have no support available to you, and you are heavily restricted in terms of what you can access. So I think, yeah, those links they have been established in research as well. And I think, yeah, we know all too well, unfortunately, the kinds of situations that NRPF makes people vulnerable to.
Thank you.
And maybe just to add the sort of an extra bit, which is about mothers. And so the level of responsibility and commitment and hopes and dreams that many of the mothers we spoke with put into their children's lives. which I think adds another layer when NRPF is denying access to support and services. This makes it, I think, even harder for mothers to contemplate leaving and into a sort of a vast unknowingness of no support whatsoever.
Thank you very much. A further question. In your research, have any of the people you spent time with applied for a change of conditions to their NRPF condition? You know, and if they had, have they been offered help to do that? Or was it just too complicated? Do you know anything about that from your research?
Sorry, it's hard when you're two people to know who's going first. Yes, so some, yeah, many of the mothers who had limited leave to remain and were able to apply for a change of conditions did so, but it often took an extremely long time for those applications to be processed. So I think there's very little support available, you know, to families to make these applications. They're complicated applications. They are often rejected or further information is required. And so I think whilst eventually, you know, being able to access public funds was sometimes available for some families, it took far too long. And there was definitely kind of serious harms that happened in between. But I think for many other families, they're not eligible to make those applications. So you know, it really depends on your visa status, and sometimes there really is very little support available to you. So the research that Rachel and I are doing now, we're seeing many more families with no recourse to public funds, with kind of different visa statuses, who can't access Section 17 support, who can't access you know, a change of conditions application to access public funds. And this really does make things very impossible in the long term. And I think it puts families in really difficult situations. So, you know, just thinking back to that last question, you know, I'm working with a family now where there was a situation of modern slavery, you know, that did affect all of the family members. But even though social services got involved, they can't offer an alternative. And so if your only source of accommodation is, you know, an abusive situation, it's very hard to know how you get out of that situation. If you're being told that you have to, you know, then what do you do?
Thank you. Rachel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to pick up on something that Eve was saying around change of conditions, which is obviously a really important thing for those families who are able to remove the NRPF from their visa. And this relates to some of the ideas we were talking about before about the way NRPF grinds people down, the way it works in the long term. And so even when the status is removed, some of the violences, some of the effects are the families we've worked with share with us still persist. And so the sort of affective feelings. So anyone say Isaac talking about the way he was made constantly to feel he did not belong, that he wasn't, you know, there was some way in which the NRPF was telling him, this is what the UK is, this is what Britain is, and who the British welfare system is for and who it's not for. And that hadn't changed even after, or that doesn't necessarily change even after the change of conditions. If it is one that is there. So I think that's something else we try and pay attention to, are these long-term impacts, the way NRPF sticks with people even after they leave that status. Yeah.
Thank you. A question now on rough sleepers. And the questioner asks, if you could say a bit about the reasons why rough sleepers don't feature in what you've said. Now, can you tell us, first of all, actually, whether in fact there were rough sleepers in your research? And if there weren't, is it because, and this is again the questioner, because of the Children Act or difficulty in reaching out to rough sleepers? So could you start, Rachel, perhaps with this?
So some of the families had times or experiences of rough sleeping or spending time on a bus all night, kind of camping out in front of the local authority office, trying to get support and so on. But most of the families had not had protracted periods of rough sleeping, which I think is what the person who's posed the question is getting at. I think partially this could be the result of the ways in which families were sometimes able to access support through the Children Act. That is potentially the case. I think it's also a reflection of the ways that for the point we were talking about earlier. So for many mothers might have stayed in situations that were exploitative or were abusive because of the accommodation for their children. So leaving an accommodation, however despicable and undesirable it was, made it kind of almost impossible to leave and end up being unhoused. Eve can say more about that. I did want to add one more thing, which is that our new project is also looking at the experience not just of families with no recourse to public funds, but unaccompanied asylum-seeking children or unaccompanied minors who are now care leavers with insecure immigration status. And those young people certainly end up being unhoused. And Malte Gambis, who's a research fellow who's working on the project, is working more directly with those young people who the Children Act is certainly not operating to protect, despite the fact that they are care leavers. Eve, did you want to add more?
Yeah, I guess just to say, that even though the families in our research have very few entitlements, the adults with NRPF have even fewer. And so, I think rough sleeping is a really systemic issue for adults, and I think there are some protections for children, obviously under the Children Act. I think, as Rachel said, many of the families did have short periods where they were sleeping in A&E or in a police station or trying to access that support from social services. I think often we also see charities trying to jump in and support families in the interim. So if they really are about to sleep in the park that night, which often is the reality, then some organizations may have some kind of exceptional funds that they use in those cases while they try and advocate for that support, which is often provided too late. So it definitely is a reality for families, but I think it's often a shorter term one. And obviously there are kind of, real dangers to rough sleeping, and many mothers, I think, are, very worried about their children in those circumstances. So they'll often try and be in a public place like A&E, I think, to protect them.
Thank you. And the very last question we have time for is, have the Home Office engaged with this research at all? And perhaps in answering it, you could say a bit about, whether you think that your research can have policy influence, and if so, how? Who would like to start with this one?
Sorry, trying to read eye signals on Zoom. After 5 years of being on Zoom all the time, I still haven't mastered this. So I'll start. So we've had some engagement with policymakers with our research, although it has been fairly limited and not directly with the Home Office. I think that there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from this research. And I think, as we were trying to say in the presentation, NRPF is a policy that is kind of intentionally punitive and intentionally enforcing destitution on people. And so I think that the kind of key lesson is, if it's not saving money, if it's not, in the language of the policy, protecting, or the justifications for the policy, protecting British resources for British people, if it's not doing any of what it says on the tin, I think there's some big questions that the research asks of the Home Office about why this policy does exist. So I think that's the kind of key question that I think our research can pose. I think it can also pose questions around the qualities, responsibilities of the various central government departments, and in terms of the extreme conditions of extreme duress. We heard about children worrying about starving in the streets of Britain. I mean, these are things that are really kind of core and key questions that policymakers need to be, I think, thinking about and engaging with. That's at the big level. And I think then there's a lot of smaller points that are important to consider, which is why is the government rolling out this 10-year period of indefinite leave or limited leave to remain for a much larger group of people? Why are they proposing to do that when we know that this is simply hurting and harming the most marginalized already? So I think these are some of the insights that our research can bring. Eve?
Yeah, I guess just to add that, that there is a government task force working on a child poverty strategy, which is due to come out in a couple of weeks. And I think there's a widespread concern that children, like the children we spoke about today, who are living in families with no recourse to public funds, will not really be very featured in this child poverty strategy and may just be completely overlooked altogether. I think we have submitted evidence. I know lots of organizations and other researchers have too. So I think it's not for lack of evidence if that does happen, but I think we will continue to try and highlight the children in these situations and highlight those or that kind of neglect if we really do see them continue to be absent from policy making around child poverty, because they are obviously at the very extreme end. So yeah, I think that's really important kind of contemporary issue.
Oh, Anne, you're muted.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really crucial point to make, and that actually you have provided evidence, and you've also made certain that you provided it to the people who are dealing with this issue in policy terms, so that it's not that it's unknown. I mean, one might ask whether Boris Johnson changed what he did. I'm not asking it after he learned about this issue, so how can we think more about policy and policy change? But crucially, this research has helped to open many people's eyes and to show how holistically we have to think about one policy, the impact on the whole of people's lives in complicated ways, including those who should not be subject to the policy because they have British citizenship anyway. Well, I hope that all of us listening will agree that this has been a stimulating and very thought-provoking talk and discussion. And for all of you in the audience, we'd really like some feedback on the session. The QR code for the feedback form is on the slide on the screen now, or going to be on the screen now. And it's a multiple choice questionnaire, and so it will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. So while you're filling that in, I would just like to tell you about the next UCL lunch hour lecture. It has the intriguing title of The Witch in the Bible and Beyond, and it will be given by Dr. Alinda Damsmar on the 18th of November at 1 o'clock, from 1 till 2 o'clock. And I would like to thank our two wonderful speakers, Professor Rachel Rosen and Dr. Eve Dickson again, and to thank you all for coming and engaging with the issue of destitution by design, immigration policy, and the conditions of life-making. I hope that these issues will be ones that you continue to think about and to discuss and to bring to people's attention as much as you possibly can. Thank you all.